Hi, I'm Kayli Smith, the co-founder and CEO at Friendlier, and I'm joined today by Jacquie Hanton. We're here to talk about why we started Friendlier and really debunk some of the environmental impact around reuse.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to talk about this today. This is such an important topic in the packaging world. There's always so much confusion around greenwashing and around true impact, and specifically about reuse in general. So we're going to talk a little bit about our journey and what we're doing and our approach to reuse and to sustainability.
Cool. Well, to start, Jacquie, do you want to just tell us about a time that sparked your interest in sustainability and your passion?
Yeah. So for me, I was living abroad in Hong Kong. I had the opportunity to live there right after we studied together in Lund in Sweden. And while I was living in Hong Kong, you experience such a contrast. It's such a beautiful place, but it's also this really hustling, bustling city. And so people are literally living on top of each other. And I remember there was one particular Wednesday, I had Wednesdays off. And so I would always get time by myself. And I went hiking in the mountains, in the forest. And I remember just being in such awe of the nature around and feeling so grateful that we live on such a beautiful planet. But at the same time, there's that contrast of the city that's right there. And you can visibly see litter and waste on the side of the trails. And there were days when you couldn't go for these hikes because the air quality was so bad. And so in that moment on that particular Wednesday, I remember thinking like, we're so lucky to live on this planet that we have, but it is so delicate and so fragile. And we need to do something now while we can to preserve this planet for future generations. So people like our children and our kids' kids can actually enjoy the planet and see the beauty of it in the way that we are so lucky to right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that was the moment where I was like, I need to do something to help stop this climate crisis that we're in. How about yourself? Is there any moment that particularly stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like yours is a story that a lot of people can probably relate to. I know we have people reach out who have gone on vacation, they've gone to the beach and seen plastic washing up, and it's that really beautiful setting that's ruined. And it's a really stark reminder of why all of this is so important. It kind of brings people back to that. But for me, I think it was during my time studying chemical engineering. I got to see a lot of manufacturing settings and chemical plants. And I remember learning about, everything that actually happens on these sites. And there's flares where they're releasing chemicals into the environment, they're burning it off. But that's happening all the time. It's really regular. Or there's leaks that end up in ponds and lakes. And this is in Canada. This isn't in some faraway place. And I was shocked and angry, really, because I thought that wasn't happening anymore. We hear so much about regulation and different things. We think there's safeguards in place, but really there's not. And that was when I felt like, okay, I need to do something and take this into my own hands, because it feels like others don't care about this and it's not actually being taken care of in the way that I thought it was.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Coming from this chemical engineering background, we were able to see the behind the scenes of how things are made and how things are processed. And I think when you think about it without that lens, you just think it's magically done and that everyone follows all of these sustainability steps.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's not the priority for most businesses, and it often gets pushed to the sidelines.
Exactly. Okay, well, let's start with the basics. Let's talk about the difference between what single use is and what reuse is.
Okay. So I think to start, we need to understand what does single use mean? And so for just a basic understanding, single use packaging is packaging that's literally designed to be used once and thrown away. And so it means that we're pulling resources, we're manufacturing something, we're using that product once, and we're throwing it away. And that's super common. I was pretty shocked to learn that actually 50% of the glass in the world that's made is made for single-use packaging. So that means 50% of all glass is literally harvested, manufactured, tons of energy goes in, and it's used for a bottle or for a can or a jar, that is going to be thrown away.
That is a crazy stat.
Yeah, and it's like that for many different materials. 40% of all plastic in the world is used for single-use packaging. 40%, that's nuts. And then if we look at pulp-based packaging, 10% of all wood harvested, so trees cut down, 10% goes towards single-use packaging, which is an enormous percentage. And it just goes to show what kind of problem that we have with single-use, things that are harvested to be used once and thrown away. We don't have those kind of resources on Earth to sustain that for much longer. And so that's single use. Reuse aims to close that gap. It aims to take these products that we've spent so much time and energy to make and actually keep them in circulation. And now the important thing to distinguish about reuse is that there needs to be a system in place to make that happen. So you can't just make a product, call it reusable, and then sell it as if it's single use. That doesn't solve any problems. But if you've created the systems to actually get those products back, wash and sanitize them, get them back into circulation, that's what reuse is. And the other thing that we want to make sure it's not confused with is refill. Now, refill is when you make a product, it is reusable, you keep it and you do reuse it at home, or you bring it back into the store to refill. That's a different situation. That is still great. But really what we want to try to encourage is this idea of reuse, so that anytime you go to a store or you go to grab food, it's coming in a reusable package by default and has the system to actually get reused.
Right. And when you're saying single use, something we use once and throw it away, you don't just mean garbage, right? We're talking about anytime we're producing a product for, a single use in its lifetime, something else could happen to it later, whether it be landfill, maybe it is recycled, maybe it is broken down, but it's still, the single use means we're producing it for one time use.
Yeah, I think the shocking thing about this that I learned is that 95% of the environmental impact of a package happens before it's even used. So all of that manufacturing, all of that transport, the energy used to get it to where it needs to be used, that front end is 95%. So we want to make sure we're not just focused on the downstream impacts. We want to look upstream as well. And how do we cut out that manufacture so we don't have to do it every single time?
Yeah, I was so shocked to hear that, because we always hear about the end of life. Like when we're talking about, especially packaging, we're talking about litter. I saw, it's washing up on the beach. You saw it in your hikes. Like these are the things that we're hearing about, and end of life is always the focus. But it's actually this upstream piece, the manufacturing, the materials, that is so much of that environmental impact.
Mm-hmm. And that leads us nicely into this idea of the circular economy. So as we're exploring reuse, something that you may have heard or people might have talked about is this idea of a circular economy and what that is. And the whole point of a circular economy is to close that loop. It's to bridge that gap, so that when we are making something, we're keeping it in circulation. And now this is contrary to the linear economy, which is what we're used to. So the linear economy is one where we thrive on selling things and going in one direction. So we make something, we sell it. It usually goes a couple rounds of sell to a distributor sells to a user, and then it ends up getting picked up by some waste management company and thrown away. And so what we aim to do with the circular economy is to close that gap. So instead of making something once, throwing it away, we're trying to keep it in circulation. So the important thing here too is we're looking at these circles, and we want to make them as small as possible. So if you think of reuse, you're taking something, you're making it, and then you are using it, washing it, and using it over again. So it's a pretty small circle. If we think of something like recycling, in our minds, it is single use. It still contributes to the circular economy because we're taking that material and we're turning it into something else, but we're losing the value of that product. We're degrading the value with each recycle, because you have to put energy in it. It gets recycled usually into something less, and then it's just more inputs into that system.
Right. So trying to minimize the amount of energy that's needed to actually build that circular system.
Yes.
Which makes sense. Reuse, you're just washing it versus recycling where you're actually having to turn it back into basically a raw material.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, most things, especially if we're talking about plastic, would be downcycled.
Yeah, exactly. And so really when you're looking at circular economy, you want to minimize the inputs and outputs. And so that's energy, that's resources, and then that's emissions coming out, that's waste coming out. Everything can be looked at like a model, and what do you have to put in, what do you have to put out, and the circular economy aims to minimize those.
Mm-hmm. And then looping back to what we were talking about with single use, I think this is where the circular system makes so much sense, because we said, the majority of the environmental impact of the product is actually in that raw material extraction, the manufacture. And so if you have a circular system and you're not requiring all of those materials and energy to manufacture, you're minimizing both that upfront environmental impact as well as the end of life. So that kind of encompasses both sides of the supply chain.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, let's talk then about what the barriers are right now, why everything isn't circular right now, and what are the challenges that are in front of us to get there.
Yeah, we are very far from a scaled circular system. And I think everyone agrees that circularity is the direction that we need to head in. But our current economy, our current way of living is set up to be linear. We live in a world where businesses, they have one goal, and it's to sell. Sell. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the documentaries. We've all been influenced by these companies. And so their number one priority is to go in one direction. And we don't have the infrastructure that exists to get things back and keep things in circulation. It's just not a core priority for businesses. Now, there's lots of really great stuff that's happening. In Canada, there's EPR that's coming into play, which is extended producer responsibility. So it means that the producers of these packages are going to have to pay for the disposal or the recycling of it. So it's essentially an added tax that gets put onto the producers. So that's really good because it's getting them to start thinking about the waste and the impact that they're having. But it doesn't move the needle as much as it needs to. We really need investment in the infrastructure. We need to be thinking about how we keep these products into circulation and who is motivated to do that. At this point, businesses aren't quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we saw the realities around what we do have in place when there were all the bans on recycled content going to, I think China was the first, but there have been other countries now to implement similar bans. And turns out most of what we thought we were recycling was actually getting sent overseas, from North America at least. And all of that broke down as soon as those bans went into place. So just highlighting how far we are really from that truly scaled circular system.
Yeah, I mean, in Canada right now, only 9% of plastics are actually recycled, which is a crazy statistic.
Yeah, that's insane.
Knowing how long the recycling program has been going, knowing how many people have curbside pickup, it is crazy that number is so low. But it just speaks to the volumes of we don't have the infrastructure to handle all of these things coming back. And it's not built in a way that really allows for effective collection and reuse or recycling of these products. And that's where reuse needs to come in.
Right. It's on both sides too. I mean, you've got the lack of infrastructure. I mean, many areas in the US don't even have recycling programs, which I think is crazy for us in Ontario and Canada, but is a reality, very close to us. But then also the materials that we're producing are extremely difficult to recycle because of how we're building them and designing them. So it's just not being considered at all, really, in that design process, which is what we need to get to.
Yeah. And I think the other big barrier is convenience. Mm-hmm. We live in a world that has become dependent on radical convenience. And so if we want to enable reuse and the circular economy at scale, it needs to be as convenient as what we've become accustomed to. Mm-hmm. And so this introduces this idea of this chicken and egg problem.
Right.
So we have consumers that are demanding convenience, but convenience can't come until we have scale. But we have businesses that need scale, And scale won't come if we don't have that convenience for consumers. We can never have a really great system if it's not scaled and it's not super convenient. But you can't get one without the other. So it really complicates this introduction of a circular economy into a world that feels already established in its ways.
And I think too that's my bias is obviously on reuse, and there's a reason for that. But when we're thinking about how we do get there, if you're looking at recycling or even, composting facilities, we're so far from having scaled infrastructure everywhere, especially one that's uniform and standardized. But reuse, what you need for infrastructure, is very light in comparison. And so when we hear a lot of discussion, especially around recycling. That's usually what everybody's thinking about. Lots of focus on compost as well. But I think we really need to bring the conversation to reuse, because, the investment that's required is much lighter than what's required for a scaled recycling, well-established supply chain and infrastructure. And so just kind of opening up the discussion further to think about what is the most effective way to do this. Let's not just keep trying to push one way, because that's what we've done up until this point, and that's where the conversation has been. But let's really take a step back and look at this from a broader perspective in terms of how we can move the needle in the most efficient way.
The one common thing that I hear in conferences around circularity about reuse specifically is, oh, well, we've tried reuse. We did this small pilot and it wasn't a success. And that's something where you hear it all the time. We did this small pilot, it wasn't a success. Well, that's where this chicken and egg problem kind of comes in. It's like, yeah, you did this small pilot, but of course it wasn't going to be this radical success because it wasn't done at scale, or it wasn't done properly.
Right.
Consumers need time to change, and they need time to learn, and they need to be guided into it, right? And so that's where we can't judge the success of a reuse program on purely just one small pilot that had very limited investment or very limited scope. Because, like we said, reuse needs scale and consumers need convenience, and that all has to go together.
And I mean, I think we'll get into this further, but we see that in practice, is that if something is, half baked or half done in a really small way, it's not going to take off in a meaningful way, of course, and it's less likely to succeed. Really, where we've seen the best demonstrations of reuse is when the brands and the partners have jumped in with 2 feet and really committed to it to make it work.
Absolutely.
So this brings us to Friendlier, which we can dive in now, because our whole goal and intention from the start has been focused on scale and how we can get there the most quickly, make it the most convenient. So why don't you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think as we started, this has always been in our mind, is we want to completely change the way people consume packaging. We want to make sure that in the future, single-use packaging is a thing of the past and reuse is at the forefront. And so in order to do that, we need to solve this problem of convenience and scale. And so when we designed our reuse program, we did it in a way that convenience was at the forefront, that it was super convenient, not only for the people who are using the package, but for the businesses that are serving it. And we wanted to make it super easy for them to offer reusable packaging and super easy for the consumer to return it, to enjoy their meal and return that packaging. And so we've done this in a way where we offer a fully turnkey reuse system. We do all of the washing, sanitation, tracking of all these packages. So for a business, all they have to do is order that packaging, use it, and then we'll come and pick it up and take all the heavy lifting off of their hands.
And just to give that context, where we're focusing is on food service applications. So we've got, things like our coffee cups, takeout containers. We're focusing on especially those high volume sites where there's a lot of single-use packaging being consumed on site.
Yeah, and that's where that scale piece gets brought in. So we know that in order for reuse to work across sectors and in an open environment, you have to have scale. You have to have convenient drop-off locations. You have to have convenient. You have to have everyone on board so that people know about it. And so by choosing to work with these food service locations where you have a frequent group of people who are going in and coming back, and it's relatively the same people, you can create those habits. You can change that behavior in this confined environment, which allows you to be able to expand out to a more open system later. So we're targeting places where people go to school every day, where people go to work every day. Eventually, we'll get into places like grocery stores, like our Farm Boy partnership, where people are going, once a week, twice a week, and it's part of their routines. And that way, we are achieving that convenience and that scale right off the bat without having to, fight for it first.
Right. And getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of how it works for businesses and for consumers, businesses can order packaging from us similar way to how they'd order single-use packaging. So really, again, making it convenient for them. When someone purchases a container, there's a deposit associated with that product. And so when they're done with their coffee, when they're done with their meal, they can claim a deposit if they'd like. All of our packages are individually tracked with QR codes. So scanning or claiming that deposit's easy. They can scan it with their phones and be able to donate to charity or claim it for themselves, and then return that package to drop-off bins that are on site, could be at another site, before we collect those and sanitize them and get them ready for reuse. So it's really that full encompassing solution on the infrastructure side, so actually physically building that reverse logistics system, as well as the software side in tracking all of those products. And that allows us to really nail down that environmental impact as well, because we know where the products are, how many are being returned, where they're being returned, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sustainability of the system itself, because that's something, as we talk about making it simple, we're obviously getting these containers back. There's a number of key things that people really focus in on those with the system. And so I think the first one that comes to mind is material selection. And it's a pretty hot topic, right, in this reuse world. Now, Friendlier has chosen a polypropylene container as their main container. Maybe let's talk through that selection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Jacquie and I, our background was chemical engineering, so we immediately nerded out on this when we first started. But really, when you're thinking about material selection, it needs to be based on a life cycle analysis. So that is looking at, all of the impacts of the product from, material extraction to end of life at some point, and all the steps between that. And so we've done that comparison based on the different materials, looking at single-use products, so single-use plastics, compostable, metals, stainless steel, for example, glass, and then reusable polypropylene or different polymers as well. And based on all of the different steps in the supply chain, you can map out how much energy, greenhouse gas emissions, water would be used in each step, from that raw material extraction, transport, manufacturing, transport, distribution, transport, end of life. That's a really simple kind of linear supply chain. And then you can do the same thing for circular. If you're looking at, okay, we're going to collect that, sanitize it, and then plug it back into the supply chain. And what does that look like? And so these comparisons are what we're using and what should be used really in designing a reuse system to identify which material is going to have the lowest environmental impact, and consider the components of the system. So how many are you going to be getting back? Because if you're producing a product that is super durable or is really, really heavy weight, and it's going to take 100 reuses for it to be able to break even from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, because it was a lot of energy to manufacture, then you better have 100% return rates, which is not super scalable. And so in our selection, we were looking at what we expect in the real world. The products we selected are actually very similar, if not a little bit less, energy and emissions to produce compared to a single-use plastic product. And so that was really important to us because we didn't want to be worse off for the environment as we're trying to drive this change. But these are the different considerations that go into which material you're selecting.
Yeah, exactly. So we're taking a product that is either the same or less impact than the products that are already being used. And then we're reusing them over and over again, which means every single time a product is reused or returned, it is driving a positive impact. And so this means that we don't have to reach a certain break-even point. Our break-even point is one reuse. Every time it gets reused, we're driving a positive impact, and that's really important. And I think I want to elaborate a little bit more on that point of what is a break-even point. What does that actually mean? And so as we think about that, every time a product is manufactured, as you said, it takes a certain amount of energy, it takes a certain amount of materials and resources. And so if you look at something like stainless steel, it takes more energy to manufacture a stainless steel container than it does a compostable container, a single-use container. So what the break-even point is the amount of times you have to use that stainless steel container for it to actually be the same or better impact than a single use. And with a stainless steel container, it can be anywhere between 20 to 100 reuses to even break even. And so with our containers, we wanted to make sure that we're going to be driving a positive impact with every reuse.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. And then based on the system and how it's designed and what the materials are, you're obviously going to have some fallout or some products that can't be reused. So can you talk about what that looks like in the Friendlier system?
Yeah, so we were really intentional. All our products actually are made in Canada, which was really important to us. We wanted to make sure everything was made locally in North America. But when a container does reach the end of its life, we have designated partners where they can recycle the polypropylene into high value products. We actually wash all of the products as they come back. Any defective product still goes through the cycle so that it gets any food residue off of it, it gets nice and clean, and so it can be turned into another high value product. With our coffee cups, they're actually manufactured in Guelph, which is where our headquarters is, and we can actually send the coffee cups back to be manufactured right back into a brand new coffee cup, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, fully circular.
Fully circular coffee cup. Yeah.
Right. So just to kind of recap, we're taking products that are already lower, greenhouse gas emission, lower energy to produce than a single-use, say, plastic product. Definitely single-use compostable, because those have a higher impact. And then every single time we're reusing them, driving down that impact.
Yeah.
And one day, end of life, they get recycled.
Yeah. I think one thing that's also really important to note with this piece on material selection, we have the environmental stats, but one thing that we can't ignore is the functionality of the container. So we have chosen a container that meets all the functionality needs of these food service locations, which means they can use it for more things. It means they're happy to use it. Exactly. So it brings in that scale piece. It means that they're not going to need a different container for a certain thing because they need it to seal so it can go into someone's backpack, or they're not going to need a different container because they don't stack well enough on their shelves and they can't store enough of them. That was all really important to hit that scale to really drive that positive impact.
Right. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it has to make sense for the business, and nobody's going to do it if it's just for sustainability reasons, really. Like, that's the reality in the business world right now. As we mentioned, there are people who are motivated, and that's awesome, but it has to meet that business piece as well to be really scalable.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this leads us nicely into return rates for reuse systems. And I actually have a hot take, maybe an unpopular opinion, but I feel for, a reuse system and for Friendlier, if we were hitting 100% return rates across the board, it would mean we were not pushing the needle enough, because what we're doing is changing consumer behavior. We're bringing reuse to applications that have never seen it before and trying to teach people. And if it was perfect, that would mean we weren't doing that. If that makes sense.
That is a hot take. And I think that's something in the reuse world, everyone strives for that 100%, that 98% return rate. And so as we talk about these break-even points, it makes sense that some 100% reuse system have to strive for that, because if you're not hitting that, you're not getting to your break-even point. But I think it's really interesting the approach that we've taken of really creating the systems so that people can return, and taking that time to change that behavior and making it accessible to everyone, so everyone gets those containers, and then training them all to return. So are you saying that return rates don't matter?
No, I'm definitely not saying that. Don't put that quote out there. But what I'm saying is that based on the system, the materials you're selecting, the product you're selecting, and based on that full life cycle analysis, that return rate that you're striving for, obviously we want to maximize them, but it might not be 100 that you need to achieve. We already talked about it. Our systems break even after a single reuse. And so depending on what the system looks like, for us, it's scale is what we're going for, accessibility, training people. You never want to be worse than a single-use product. That's kind of the red line that I would draw. But how do we start to change that consumer behavior at a really big scale? And it's going to mean, I think, that things are not perfect right off the bat. It's going to take time to change that behavior and to grow. And I mean, recycling is 9% of plastics are recycled right now. So we have the opportunity to blow past that number, but not necessarily trying to create that perfect system today. It's just not going to be there.
I think one thing to keep in mind is if you look at single-use packaging today, just as it is, if tomorrow everything were to switch to a reuse alternative and we got half of them back, you would literally cut down the amount of things ending up in a landfill or the amount of production needed for a new product in half, which is crazy. And that's what we want to strive towards. We want to strive towards that massive adoption of reuse,
right,
and do it in a way that can scale. But I think the important thing when we're looking at return rates is a really good indication of progress. So when we launch at a site, we want to see what the return rate is, and we are always striving to make that better on the site. And maybe it's when you start, it's going from 50 to 60 to 70, and then maybe it's incremental, 90 to 91 to 92, and it's less, but you always want to see that progress on a site-by-site basis to show that the education is happening, to show that you're building those habits.
The consumers are learning, and they're understanding.
Exactly. And that's really the aim of the game, is to drive that progress every place you go, to show that we are teaching people, we are training people, and we are changing the world.
Yeah, love it. I'm there. And then another piece I think that is always a question that we get is the transportation, because when it's the first thing that everyone's minds go to, okay, so you're taking products off site, you're washing them somewhere. Doesn't that transportation hurt your environmental impact? Like, what does that look like?
I think this is such a funny one, because I have never once heard someone ask the same question around recycling.
Right.
Every municipalities will have a recycling program. We sometimes send our recycling, like you said, overseas.
Right. Asia.
It is such a funny topic, because it would seem so crazy for everyone to put a recycling plant in their own system, in their own location. Like, you don't have offices setting up mini recycling plants or mini composters. So I think it's important to note that every single system that exists right now has an aspect of transportation, but reuse has the opportunity to actually minimize that, because we're doing it in these localized hubs. And so instead of our single-use products coming from China or coming from Europe or the US or from far away, we're creating this minimized system, this minimized transportation system. And instead of our products going from one location, from a manufacturing location to a processing location to a distributor to the end user, then to a recycling place somewhere, we're keeping that trip very short, and it's just from Friendlier to the location and then back to Friendlier.
Right. It's a really local supply chain.
It's a local supply chain. And in that, you're able to create lots of jobs for those wash facilities. You're able to take off that burden of the office or the food service location that's using the products. But it is transportation, and it is something that does emit. So what kinds of things is Friendlier doing to reduce their impact from a transportation perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's considered in the life cycle analysis, right? So that's considered as part of that impact for the reuse supply chain, and definitely something that would always be calculated and included in that. At Friendlier, we create regional hubs. So we have 3 across Canada right now, and as we said, we're building those local supply chains so that products don't have to move as far as they normally would. And I agree with what you said of it being a funny question, because nobody asks that about their single-use products. Where were they manufactured and where were they coming from? But it is good to be thinking about these things, and it shows that we're considering, the environmental impacts of the whole process, which is good. But we are actually moving towards EVs. So we're super excited to have our first EV van for deliveries, and we're going to be continuing to do that. So that will just continue to drive down the emissions of that reuse cycle and what that looks like, and help us continue to drive up our impact.
Yeah, because Friendlier owns the whole process. It owns the deliveries, the pickups, the washing. It enables us to continuously improve on those processes, and we're motivated from a greenhouse gas emissions, from a sustainability, but also from a business perspective, to be as efficient as possible. And so because we control that whole process, we can report on it, we can measure it, and we are constantly looking at ways to improve it. So the electric vehicles is such a great way that we can reduce our impact there. And then the other piece is how we're doing route optimization to make sure that when we deliver, we're picking up at that same time. We're not sending 2 different vehicles, like if you were to receive a single-use packaging delivery and then have another waste hauler come to pick up the waste.
Right.
Because we own that full process, we can really understand it, measure it, and then improve it.
And I think just what's so cool about what we're building and what goes into the infrastructure behind this is that we're building a whole nother piece of the supply chain that really hasn't existed. We have such a well-established forward supply chain, you could say, of getting products to consumers, but we don't have a well-established reverse infrastructure, and that's, I think, why recycling is not working. There's many reasons, but that's really been a missing piece in actually building that circular economy, and it requires the infrastructure to be built. Like, we're just not there. We need that full system to be able to really scale any circular model in a meaningful way.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to how we actually do it. I mentioned kind of briefly the system that Friendlier has built, but let's talk about deposits and how we motivate people to actually return.
So this is an interesting one, and I think it's important to note that there's not one size that fits all in every single situation that we're in.
Right.
So you mentioned Friendlier. We use deposits generally for most applications to try and incentivize consumers to bring back those products. But in places like an elementary school where they're using the products, we're not going to use deposits.
Yeah, the kids will be pulling out their phones. No.
Yeah, kids aren't bringing money to school. They're not tapping their phones or doing anything there. So that makes no sense. And so it's important to note that there needs to be a flexibility to the program. However, in a university or in an office cafeteria, it does make sense in a lot of cases. And so the reason we decided to go with this deposit return model is because it's something that's so widely understood and widely scaled. We have it in Ontario at the Beer Store's bottle return program. We've seen it work tremendously to encourage people to bring back their reusable bottles. And it's understood globally. We see it across the world, where there's very successful DRS schemes.
I was actually just speaking to someone from Germany, and they didn't know what we did, and they explained to me the whole deposit system, and they were like, "This is what we do across Germany. It works so well. We don't understand why everyone else in the world isn't doing this." And I was like, "Yeah, no, I get you. That's exactly what we're trying to do." But it's true. It's a very well-established system that has been scaled, and we've seen success not just in other areas of the world, but specifically in North America, of this working well. And the Ontario, beer bottle return system is a great example of that.
I think as we're teaching consumers new behavior, we're trying to get them to return a product to a return bin, not to a garbage or to a recycling bin. We want to minimize the amount of change for them. We want to minimize the amount of new things that they have to learn. And knowing that most people have this idea of how deposits work just ingrained into them is just such an easy way to incentivize people to return that product.
And it's so accessible because it can just be, the deposit's part of the cost of the product, and everybody automatically gets that reusable product in their hands. So we can really drive that scale piece that we're always harping on.
That's a really important piece there, the accessibility of it. I think we would be having a very different conversation if that deposit was $10.
Right. Yeah, it has to be reasonable.
Yeah. And so the deposit return schemes that we've seen globally, we're talking about, 50 cents. Right. We're not talking about deposits of $10, $20. Because one thing that's really important with these systems is that they maintain that accessibility. So it's a nice balance of accessibility, but also meaningful enough that people want to go through the motions to bring back that product, to get that money back.
Well, I think the cool thing too, and this was something we actually saw in Sweden, is all of their park garbages would have beer cans, and I think it was any can actually, sitting on top of the garbages so that other people could collect them who wanted the deposit. And we see this in Ontario as well. If I put out my blue bin with, beer cans, probably somebody's going to come by, pick those up. And so it's instilling value in those products, and that also helps reduce litter, because now if you don't see beer cans laying around as much, because someone's going to go pick those up, because there is that associated value. They can actually create money. They're incentivized to get it to the right spot.
We're almost creating this this reverse logistics economy, right? We're adding value to the backwards economy and incentivizing people to bring things back and put it in the right locations. So it can really change the way that people are consuming and interacting with products.
Right. And then some of the other incentives, I guess, that are there and that need to be there to be able to drive that behavior change. Obviously, convenience, having the collection bins in the right sites that are accessible to people, because you could have that deposit there, but if it's incredibly hard to get to the right bin or the right spot, nobody's going to do it.
And sometimes convenience is enough. Sometimes people don't care about any money back. People don't care about anything else other than, hey, the bin's there. I can just drop it there.
They're sorting anyways. Yeah. They're looking for the waste bin.
Sometimes it's enough.
And then the other things that we're doing are donations. So for users on our platform, they can donate their deposits to charity. So that's really cool. We've seen a ton of money go through there, which is just like a bonus to the system, that it can give back to the community. And I think it's cool to see how we're creating those local supply chains and then also feeding money back into the local charities. So that's just a cool piece of it. And then things like badges for users who are scanning their or engaging in the platform, returning their products, tracking their impact so they can actually see personally what they're doing is also helpful. I know I always like to track my own stats on whatever app. So that's just another piece of it that can help incentivize those users.
Well, that's where that social piece comes in as well, right? Like you can share with your friends that, you've helped save a brick's worth of waste or a chihuahua's worth of waste. And it just makes it fun to share something and to interact with your friends.
Right. Well, I feel like we've given a good kind of overview on the landscape, reuse as a whole, what we're doing. But I think kind of the big underlying message is that replacing single-use packaging and trying and disrupting this way of doing things, this linear economy, is a big undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Huge.
the big thing is making sure that we're building a system that is scalable, it's accessible, and really driving progress over perfection. So moving the needle forward. Probably not going to be perfect today. If it was, that would mean we weren't changing anything. But really creating those stepstones to get there to the place where we have that fully scaled reverse supply chain in place that can then be a great example for other systems in the future.
Yeah, we're taking it into our own hands, right? We are driving that progress so that we can get to that world where everything is reusable and that single use is a thing of the past. For you, what do you picture, like in the perfect world? What does that world look like for you?
Yeah, I think when I think about the future, I realize how much more packaging there's going to be as everything's delivered to our homes now. Even they're like food service, yes, more takeout, more meals being delivered to the home, but in every regard there's just more packaging in the world. And really what I've always visualized is this world where, similar to how recycling is at our house, we drop it in the blue bin, it's easy, it's built into the way we do things, we can build reuse into the way we're doing things, where it is a behavior that everybody knows, it is part of our culture and part of what we do, and we have these local supply chains that can actually keep the products in use. Mm-hmm. And so that's I want to be able to scale reuse to really take over that single-use packaging market and build this whole new economy where we're instilling that value in products and really driving that value forward.
Mm-hmm. And imagine the community aspect of that. Like, everyone knows that they're sharing they're sharing packaging, we're sharing resources, and we have enough resources to sustain the future generations, right, because we're all contributing to it together and we have that infrastructure to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
Awesome. Well, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for chatting with me, and we hope that everyone could learn something new today.
Awesome.